Okay, everyone, so welcome to this special episode of SNEED-CAST. We'll be talking about the importance of extended producer responsibility in terms of for small businesses as well as for all businesses alike. Today, I am joined by Michelle Carver, who is the Director and COO over at Lorax EPI, as well as Lydia Geddes, who is the Business Development Manager over at Lorax EPI. So hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Hi.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So to start off, if you guys could provide us with what is extended producer responsibility, also known as EPR?
Sure. So EPR is a set of legislation which is designed to ensure that products are correctly managed really at the end of life, and that there is the funding mechanism in place to be able to support the recycling infrastructure or the reuse infrastructure that needs to be there. So in essence, EPR is, as it describes, extended producer responsibility means that the producer remains responsible for that product even after it's going to get thrown away. So after it's been used by a consumer and then thrown out into the bin or hopefully recycled.
So one of my questions as a consumer is, do companies across all industries have to adhere to EPR regulations, or is it only companies that really focus on producing consumer goods?
Well, the EPR legislation does cover a lot of different legislation. So packaging is probably the most high profile one, I guess, we see at the moment, but it also covers electronic products. So actually when the electronic item is then going to be thrown away, or the battery that sits inside it needs to be thrown away. And at the moment, we see a real growth in areas of things like textiles and deposit return programs. So no, it doesn't only include consumer goods products. It's also any product which is packaged would be probably in scope of the packaging directives or the packaging legislation that we see. There are some exemptions. So there are things sometimes around medical devices or maybe certain types of packaging that are exempted. But on the whole, if you make a product and you sell it in packaging, it would be part of the packaging legislation in the markets that have it.
Interesting. So now that we know a little bit more about EPR, we actually want to know more about Lorax EPI. So what is it that you guys all do? And how is it that you guys help companies adhere to EPR regulations and compliances?
So we are a business that has been set up to help companies do the actual reporting to the EPR program. So there's a lot of different businesses all around the world that are involved in EPR. There's people who design legislation. There's people who support the legislation. There are things called PROs, which are the producer responsibility organizations that companies actually comply to, and then they help comply on their behalf. But we, Lorax as a business, have been set up to help businesses do the reporting piece. That means helping them to collate all the data. It means helping them to understand if they're obligated by the legislation, and then it helps them to make sure that they can put that report into the organization needed so that they can remain compliant with the legislation.
Okay. And then when I was looking on you guys' site, I actually came across Envy, the software that you guys have. So what data does Envy collect, and what metrics does it provide to consumers?
Well, Envy is a tool which brings in information about products and their packaging, and also it brings in information about the items placed on the market, so the sales units, not the sales values, but the sales volumes that have been placed on the market. And it makes calculations that bring those two pieces of information together. So it understands, for example, how much plastic was placed into a market like Germany, or how much paper was used in California. And it can bring together those two pieces of information. It then applies the local rules, which are required for each country or state or province. And then it creates a report out in the format that's required for that particular jurisdiction. So in essence, it's meant to save everybody a lot of time, because all the different rules in every different country are different. And this streamlines the ability for a business to have a single point of truth for all of their packaging and their product data, and then to be able to create reports out for each of those markets. And it's really a global phenomenon now. It's definitely was a European-centric set of legislation a long time ago, but over the last few years it's really expanded, and certainly coming into the US now we see some of the first packaging EPR programs. EPR has been in the US in terms of electronics or batteries for a long time, but certainly in terms of packaging, this is kind of a new wave of legislation for people to look at.
If you had to get some advice to, say, startup companies or companies that are looking to adhere to EPR regulation, what are some features for a software that you would recommend looking for?
Well, you need to have, specifically in this field, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, you need to be able to collect in any type of data that is related to the particular product or packaging. So there are so many different pieces of data that you need to understand about the packaging or the product, so, such as whether it's what material is used, the weight, what color it is, what size it is. And so you need to be able to find a database that can bring all of those different levels of information in and hold them all together and be able to apply local rules. So you can't just say, well, whatever we end up reporting in California will be the same as what we report in Oregon. It won't be. And so you definitely need to be able to be more granular in the information you're collecting and then be able to be granular in the information that's pushed out.
But when you work with companies like, say, Lorax, EPI, do you guys, upon having a new customer, whenever you guys have that consultation, do you collect data or do you go through that whole process and figure out what information needs to be collected, if that makes sense?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So that's one of the first things we do up front with businesses. You know, the analysis piece of what a business already has in terms of packaging data, we offer as a service so that we can go into their data systems and have a look, compare it to what we know are the requirements of the programs, depending on where they need to report around the world. And we will then analyze that and produce them a report to show them where they are really on that kind of data scale of what they really need, what they have today and what they're going to be able to need for tomorrow.
So I know that whenever we've studied the industry, we hear a lot about these big players such as like Coca-Cola or Pepsi or Frito-Lay that are now jumping onto the sustainability movement and making vast improvements to their production processes as well as like their packaging to make sure that they're now complying with certain EPR standards. But when it comes to, like, say, startup and small businesses, are there different tiers or considerations? As well as, is there like a specific EPR impact to like startup and small businesses?
Yeah,
I'll let you
so it's really going to depend on where that startup business is selling into, because every single EPR stream is going to be completely different. There is no harmony across EPR streams. So in the majority of countries, there are material and turnover thresholds for reporting. So that may exempt those businesses that are startups or smaller businesses from having to declare their data. However, that's not the same for everywhere. So some markets like France, for example, if you are a smaller producer, so if you are placing less than 500,000 units onto the market annually, you still have to report, but you can do a simplified report. Whereas others, like in Germany, the first time you place a piece of packaging on the market, you need to declare that and create a report. So unfortunately, there's not one rule that suits everything. So my suggestion would definitely be for companies to you need to have a way to identify what those thresholds and the rules for reporting are in each country as you are launching into new markets or looking at the market that you start in. What is my obligation and should I be reporting? Because if you're not, they may come after you and get you to report one way or the other.
Right. Yeah, no, I was definitely going to ask about that just because we work with so many startup and small businesses ourselves. I know that we have tons of like moms and pop shops as well as like starters that are literally starting out of like their homes, their garages. So it's interesting to hear that there's not like one set threshold or like one set regulation in place. That's definitely something for our consumers to keep in mind.
In the US, I'd actually say that the thresholds are more based around the turnover value as well. So just to bear in mind that you sometimes have to hit a specific, so the examples Lydia gave was, units placed into the market. So if you sold 500,000 units, but actually in the US, there are turnover thresholds. You have to hit, $5 million turnover in some places, $2 million turnover in some places to be able to qualify for that particular US program. But that's not that we'd see different thresholds in different places, like Lydia said.
Actually, now that we're talking about different turnovers or like different limits that they have to hit, are there any kinds of like pros when it comes to like reporting EPR or like hitting those EPR regulations? Like, are there any kind of like tax credits that businesses get, or just anything that would benefit? Or is it just a legal compliance that has to be met?
I'm afraid to tell you that it's just a legal compliance. I'm afraid there won't be anything that you can kind of offset against that. No, it will be, the purpose of this legislation is to ensure that businesses are making good decisions at the beginning of the life of a product so that they can design good packaging and they can design good products so that at the end of life, the impact on the environment is much less. And so there are no credits in terms of like an R&D credit or anything like that you can gain. In terms of the fees that are charged, though, their fees are weighted depending on those decisions. So if you have created a product with, good environmental intentions, you've used, an easily recyclable, collectible material, then you end up paying a lower cost. And if you end up making decisions that will have a detrimental end of life, then you will be paying a higher cost. So there's no money you can claw back, so to speak, but this is a financial implication on a business. EPR reporting is cost at the end of the day, and those costs can be minimized by making good decisions.
I would also add as well
design.
Is the failure to not report can often restrict market access. So I see it a lot of times with our customers that if they have not registered with the PRO, they cannot submit a tender for a specific work contract. And you have to prove that you are reporting and you are compliant in order to then further your business and sell into certain markets and not have any sanctions against that selling in those certain markets. So that it does open up access to things like tenders as well. And that is one benefit of it.
Yeah. That's a really good point, Lydia, because I think we've definitely seen also when companies aren't doing what they say what they should be doing, they actually can even have their products stopped at the border. In certainly European markets, we've seen that where companies can't even sell into that particular market because they haven't fulfilled or proved that they're members of these organizations where they need to report packaging or product waste.
It's interesting to hear that can actually stop product from getting into the markets that they needed to get into. But on that note, can you actually share some of the success stories that you guys have had, or case studies where EPR has made like a significant impact?
Well, it's not as easy to sort of define a specific use case, but I mean, you can certainly look at markets where EPR has been in place for a long time now. Markets which have an EPR system in place, such as the European markets, do tend to have high recycling rates, better collection rates, and there are some real flagship markets across Europe that have 70+% recycling rates, 90+ on some specific formats like bottles, which is a real success story for recycling and the recovery of material. It's not to say it's worked perfectly everywhere, though, and there certainly are still places, even in mature EPR markets, which still have very low recycling rates, and that investment in the infrastructure hasn't been made. But I think the fact that now what we see as a trend globally is that most countries are looking at EPR as a policy tool does show that most people believe that it is more positive than negative.
On that note, what would you say are like some key considerations or some pieces of advice that you would give us startup businesses when designing their products to keep like EPR principles in mind?
So the purpose of EPR is this end of life management to make sure that you're thinking about how the product or the packaging will be dealt with at the end of life. So the most important thing is to consider that up front when you're designing a piece of packaging or your product that you're going to sell. So thinking about how you think somebody might manage this at the end of life is the most important thing to think about in terms of EPR, because that's where eventually your cost will come in when you place it onto the market, when you have to make that report. So think, could it be recycled? Could it be reused? Could it be refilled in the process that currently exists in that state or the jurisdiction where you're reporting it? The other thing for startups to consider is that they really need to make sure they're collecting good data about the products which they're creating, because you're ultimately going to need that data to create these reporting mechanisms. So make sure that all the way along the chain, you're collecting good data. And even if maybe you're selling somebody else's product, maybe if you're manufacturing through a third party, at some point if you're the responsible party, will have to make the report. And so just saying, oh, well, I bought it from, someone we don't know, or it doesn't matter.
Right.
You're still going to be responsible. And so making sure that you've got good data stewardship and good data governance is going to be really important for all businesses, because as soon as you become obligated, you're going to have to think about how you're going to fulfill the reporting requirements.
And what would you say are some of the most common challenges that companies have when trying to comply with EPR regulation? And how do companies like Lorax EPI help to overcome them?
Firstly, the biggest difficulty people have is the fact that there is absolutely no harmonization with EPR reporting globally. So one of the biggest challenges is that businesses need to track what the EPR regulations are in each country, and not only track what they are, track how they change, and also therefore how they apply to their business model. What is needed for one EPR report isn't going to be needed for another. The data parameters are going to be different, not only the way that the reports are formulated and what they require, then the way that you're submitting those reports and how you get that information to the producer responsibility organisation is going to be completely different. And as I said, they also change so regularly. You might get your head around it for 1 year, and then the next year they completely change the report. It's what we see a lot in Europe at the moment. We spend a lot of our time as a development team kind of ensuring that the reports that we're delivering to clients are in the format that scheme need. And then secondly, Michelle spoke about it a moment ago. It's actually the data. It's having that. You might know the regulations and know what you need to do, but you actually then therefore need to have the data in place to be able to fulfill those reporting obligations. And I speak to a lot of customers, a lot of big companies as well as smaller ones, that really don't have a handle on what their data looks like, and that is a full bill of material for all of the packaging information that they sell. That will be what is the customer taking home, what is it being packaged into, what is it being shipped into, and then alongside, there obviously isn't just packaging EPR. If you're selling an electrical product, there's also going to be electrical reporting to do. Or if you're selling clothing, there's also maybe textiles EPR obligations. So it quickly becomes, even if you're only selling a few products, it could quickly become quite a lot of different reports that you need to create. So in my opinion, obviously, us working for Lorax EPI, our advice would be to work with a business that can provide you kind of from the ground up support. So that is tracking the legislation, being able to apply that legislation to your business and how you work. Also then being able to doing consulting support, register you with the producer responsibility organisations, but then also then having a infrastructure where we can do the reporting for you. So having a data management system, all of the data in, and then translate it to the exact requirements for each scheme. So then you've gone from one data set to us being able to support you with every single different type of EPR stream that is needed. And also then it being adaptable. It's not just ready now. We can adapt and change. We're seeing that a lot in America at the moment. Obviously, there's a lot of unanswered questions as to what the EPR reporting is going to look like. You want to be able to work with a company that can kind of mold to that. It's definitely going to save a lot of work internally for sure.
So since you mentioned the EPR regulation is constantly changing, and since you guys focus on tracking all of that, and this might be for speculation, but what future developments in EPR should companies look out for?
Well, from an EPR perspective, the most important thing people in the US need to look out for is the growing scope of the legislation. So right now, there are 4 states with the legislation passed, but the rules and the requirements for each of those 4 states is not yet final. It's in progress. There's a lot of negotiation going on. So what's happening at the moment is that really can flex and change even day to day. When we see a new rule set, the rulemaking processes come out. So companies really need to firstly of all be adaptable to that and be aware that something that is maybe they're in scope for today, they might not be in scope for tomorrow, and also vice versa. They might find that the legislation has, changed when the final version comes out, and they then have some type of obligation against it. So there's that. The scope is changing all the time. The data which Lydia had mentioned about earlier about the amount of data which companies need to be aware of that they need to be collecting at the moment is quite a lot of data. Right. We work with information at the product level, the bill of material level, the component level, the sales level, and there's a lot of parameters which you could need in order to understand exactly which products are obligated. But I guess the other thing to be aware of here is that even though there are 4 states in the US today, there are many more states right now with legislation being proposed or on the table or in sessions being negotiated, and they may not pass this session. Again, I know we're coming up towards end of legislative sessions in terms of US states, but they have now been on the table for a couple of years and they will keep coming back. And every single time they come back, there are people who are very keen on passing more of this legislation. And so eventually in time, what that could turn into is federal policies. And that will then have a huge impact on all businesses, because whilst it may just be pockets of people at the moment who are thinking about this, then we may see some more federal movement on that in the future. So the wider scope of the legislation and also the actual breadth of how much there is coming through, companies really need to be keeping an eye on that.
So with so many moving parts and with so much legislation and regulation being updated, what would you say is a good place for startup companies or companies of any side to get started in terms of implementing EPR practices into their businesses?
Yeah, so start at the beginning. Start to look at your products and see whether you're going to be in scope. And that means looking at your products also for, have we really thought about these from an end-of-life perspective, not just shipping them or not just creating them. And then the second most important thing to consider is whether you're collecting enough information, or whether you have at your fingertips enough information about all your products, so that if you fall into scope of it, you can actually do that reporting.
And then we've got into our last question. What resources or support systems would you say are available for companies looking to better understand and apply EPR principles into their operations?
Well, we of course have lots of information, and you're very welcome to come and talk to us about the information we hold. We have a monthly newsletter which people can subscribe to if they're interested, and then other support services too. But the best thing about EPR really at the moment is that lots of people are talking about it, and that means there are lots of pieces of information. There are plenty of blogs written, there's plenty of articles written, there's plenty of white papers written, and then of course this is a huge, certainly in our world, but we live in EPR world, so we see it a lot. But there is a lot of noise and talk about it. And the other things to consider as well are that the push. There's just been a very recent treaty negotiation last week in Canada, which is for the Global Plastics Treaty, and so there is a lot of push and guidance and documents which is coming out of there, which really supports EPR and talks a lot about EPR. So there are plenty of places at the moment that you can get hold of, understanding EPR legislation. And then when you're ready to take the next step and come and talk about solutions and how you can work with it, then we're happy to talk to any companies and guide them through that process.
Sounds great. Well, Lydia and Michelle, I'd also like to open the floor in case I missed anything, or if you'd like to give any pieces of advice, any information that you think companies could find useful. But if you feel like we've covered everything, then we're also good to go.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground, and I don't know what you think, Lydia, but sometimes I think when you hear about EPR for the first time, sometimes it can seem really overwhelming, and we've probably not done a great job of not making it seem overwhelming, because it really is. And there's a lot going on, and depending on where you are, what company you are, and what type of products you sell, and where you're selling them, it can make a big difference about whether you need to be thinking very seriously about this or not. We would advise everybody to just go and have a look. Don't leave this till the last minute. And if we were to put some deadlines and some sort of timings around that, if this is going to be a piece of legislation that affects you, you need to consider that by the start of next year, you could potentially need to provide data for reporting. And so we really are sort of only about 6 months, just over 6 months out from companies being able to achieve that. So I don't want to make anybody nervous about it, but certainly just to think about, the impacts on them and whether they would be in scope. Just have a look. Don't leave it till the last minute.
Well, thank you so much for all of the great information that you provided today. And also thank you for joining us on our little podcast. We really appreciate it.
No problem. It's been a pleasure talking to you.